Welcome to Reality Bytes Radio. Delighted to have a guest on tonight, Paul Craig Roberts. If you want to introduce yourself, Paul, because some people want to hear you, and then your view that the recent attacks on the Charlie Hebdo offices in Paris were the work of the CIA.
Okay, Neil. I'm a former Assistant Secretary of the United States Treasury, a former Wall Street Journal editor, and have held many academic appointments. I have a website, which is paulcraigroberts.org. The attacks on Charlie Hebdo have many of the characteristics of a false flag attack, particularly the claim that these professional killers left their ID in the getaway car. That reminds me of the claim that the passport of Muhammad Atta was found in the ruins of the World Trade Center buildings. The only intact item in the two skyscrapers was this passport. So when you encounter this type of identification of the suspects, then you know something is afoot. Whether or not the attack is a false flag attack or a real attack, it has served several purposes. One, it seems to have stopped the move toward an independent foreign policy by the French government. You may remember just recently the French government had voted with the Palestinians against Washington and Israel. And recently, the French president had announced that the economic sanctions against Russia must end. These were very unpopular signs of an independent foreign policy on the part of Washington's vassal state. All of that movement toward independence has stopped. Also, I think the attacks have hurt the growing European sympathy for the Palestinians, and they have hurt the rising European opposition to more American wars in the Middle East, this time against the Islamic State. So Washington, or the neoconservatives who run the foreign policy in Washington, have recovered their position, and they now have things back under control. So that is the outcome for the neoconservatives, independently of who was behind the attack. Another outcome, Neil, is that the Charlie Hebdo affair has very much raised the political influence and presence of the right-wing parties in Europe. We now have Marie Pen in France, because all of these millions of protesters in favor of the French cartoonists, these are the anti-immigrationists. It has also raised the profile of Farage in England. It's raised the profile of the right-wing parties in Germany. And so what you are witnessing now is the prospect of the overthrow of the ruling European political parties in the coming elections, because the massive outpouring of support for the French cartoonists, this shows the strength of the anti-immigration parties, the anti-EU parties, the anti-Euro parties. So this has great implications for the future of European politics. And also, it has implications for the ability of Washington in the future to continue to treat Europe as puppet states or vassal states. I very much doubt Farage is going to be a Washington puppet, or that Marie Le Pen would be a Washington puppet. And so it shows the potential here to break up Washington's European empire. So these are all the real massive implications of these events.
Well, I'm not so sure that Nigel Farage won't bend over backwards to go with anybody, but that's just my own opinion. Do you think this is anything to do with the old Gladio type technique? in terms of what's going to happen in relation to like domestic security, if you like, right across Europe, particularly in the UK, where they of course have jumped on the bandwagon here, and we're going to get more draconian rules like stop and search in the street and this kind of thing.
Yes, of course, the military security agencies will use the attack to tighten down and to increase the reach of the police state in Europe. This has already happened, of course, in the United States. So yes, I think one consequence of the Charlie Hebdo affair will be the strengthening and enlargement of the police state throughout Europe, particularly in France and Britain, but throughout Europe. And of course, the claim that this is all in defense of free speech, this is an obvious lie, because today France arrested 54 people for essentially harmless remarks on Facebook or Twitter, and they have arrested the black cartoonist. All of a sudden, when he says something controversial, it's not free speech, it's hate speech, because it's not directed at a group that it is acceptable to demonize. So Muslims can be demonized. You can say anything you want about them. You can offend them in any manner that you want, but you can't make a joke about a Jew or an Israeli, or you can't say anything that could look like you had some sympathy with Muslims, because that implies you are a terrorist sympathizer. So this sort of hypocrisy is accepted. It's transparent. Everybody sees it, and yet it continues. Well, when you accept that kind of a hypocrisy, that kind of a double standard, you've already agreed to thought control. You've already agreed that there are some things that can't be said, and that only demonized groups can be criticized. So this is a serious development. It certainly goes against any sort of liberties or civil rights in these European countries.
Well, certainly in terms of what can be said, what can't be said, I see the BBC's Tim Wilcox has been attacked by the Jewish community or some group calling themselves the Lobby, UK Zionist group, for basically asking the question that don't you think Israel is unpopular because of its treatment of the Palestinians? And he's been vilified by the Israelis in London now.
Yes, of course. In fact, all of this is greatly to the benefit of the Israelis. And not only that, but these right-wing groups will be allied with the Israelis, because the right-wing groups are anti-immigration. The immigrants are Muslims, and so they oppose the same people that the Israelis oppose. So you will see some sort of a unity between these rising right-wing parties, the anti-immigration parties, and Israel, because they both are directing their fire and attack on the same group, the Muslims.
Yeah, in terms of the reaction to this, it's way over the top. I mean, we're not talking hundreds of people here being killed. We're talking a dozen. I mean, it's still a dozen people, but the reaction worldwide with so-called world leaders, going to Paris and marching down the street and all this theatre, if you like, and the fact that they had posters out, the Je suis Charlie posters out, an hour or so after the shooting was the first thing that caught my eye. I wondered how they got them printed up so quickly. Maybe they knew it was coming. I don't know.
Well, we don't know, but as you note, Neil, there's many elements of orchestration here. I mean, how did you assemble 40 or 44 or 50, however many world leaders it was, so quickly? How do you get such massive demonstrations assembled so quickly? It's not just the hypocrisy of it. For example, we didn't see this type of demonstrations when the Israelis went in and killed 1,500 women and children in Gaza. We don't see these demonstrations over the past 13, 14 years when the United States slaughters women and children in 7 Muslim countries with invasions, bombs, drones. Here we're talking about huge numbers of dead people in destroyed countries, and there haven't been these protests. And yet, a few French cartoonists who are way over the top, who go out of their way to insult and antagonize, a few of them get shot, and all of a sudden, this is the worst thing that's ever happened in history. It doesn't mean it's a good thing, but it does seem out of proportion that you get such a massive demonstration over something that is small compared to the other kinds of deaths that are simply accepted day in and day out. So it does strike me as an orchestrated event. I also noticed, Neil, and you may have noticed, that the professionalism of the gunmen who attacked the cartoonist office, these were highly trained professionals. The fact that they got away is amazing. And they seem like totally different people than the two brothers 2 days later who are bumbling and incompetent, and they're trapped in a printing office, a printing plant or something like that. It seems like two different sets of people. And it looks to me like the purpose of the ID left in the getaway car was to identify the brothers as the culprits. And yet the brothers show none of the skills or the abilities that the gunman who attacked the cartoonist office displayed. So the whole thing is odd in many ways. You may also know that it's very odd that the third alleged terrorist, the younger guy, when he heard that on social media that his name was circulating as one of the 3 terrorists, he instantly went to the police because he realized he was going to be killed by the security police as a terrorist. He went to the police, turned himself in. He has an ironclad alibi. He was nowhere near the place. There's all kinds of witnesses. And so somehow they were wrong about him, but right about the 2 brothers. And notice, too, when these types of events happen, the alleged terrorists are always killed. They're never captured. If they're captured, they have to be questioned. They may have a different story than the official one. It would have been easy to capture the 2 brothers. They could have used stun grenades, tear gas. It would have been easy. Instead, they kill them. Well, when the people are killed on the basis of an ID in a getaway car that could have been planted there, it's very suspicious. It's also suspicious. Why kill them? Why not capture them, question them, find out more? It would be a far better use of the security forces to have them alive and not dead. So there are many aspects of this that just don't seem right.
Yeah, but I mean, it's very similar to the 7/7 attacks, where the supposed perpetrators were shot down at the newspaper offices where they were trying to turn themselves in and saying they've been set up. But that report only went out on the first day or 2 and then disappeared. But again, another aspect of this that certainly helped the British monarchy was it got Prince Andrew off the front pages, and I think the Queen maybe sent her thanks to Francois Hollande for his work. I don't know, but Prince Andrew's story just more or less disappeared out the British media, and the only reports I saw after that were almost basically saying that was done and dusted now. He's just going to have to get on with his job, and his name will be cleared eventually, and that's the end of it. So, yeah.
Well, it did change the focus of a lot of things. For example, Russia, Ukraine. I don't know if you've heard the news that Russia has cut off the gas flows.
I did hear George Soros mouthing off the other day that Europe should give $50 billion to Ukraine to fight Russia.
Well, I think the cutoff of gas sends a message to Europe. I mean, it's certainly not sensible for the Russian government to subsidize the European countries that are committing economic war against Russia.
Well, of course, we're coming up to the coldest month of the year in Europe. Mid-January to mid-February, and I can imagine people in Germany start to panic a little when the gas goes off and they can't heat their homes.
Yeah, well, it's mainly affecting, Neil, 6 of the smaller countries that are dependent on the pipeline flow through Ukraine, because the Russians haven't cut off the other pipeline flows. And Europe probably doesn't have much concern for the 6 smaller countries. But it is a warning that more could fall.
Right. And who could blame them, really?
And
who could blame them for doing it?
Sorry.
Yeah, and we see the price of gas here has just dropped below $2 where I am, and people here thought they'd never see that again, and it's quite incredible. I'm thinking $2 a gallon. God, it's like £6 or £7 in the UK a gallon. It's crazy, But anyway, how do you think that's affecting Russia, the price of gas?
Well, I don't know, because I think on the whole it's been very helpful for Russia, because it's convinced them they have to pull themselves out of the Western dollar-based payment system, and they have to reorient themselves toward the East, toward China. They don't need to use the dollar anymore for their international payments. They're pulling out of the SWIFT clearing system. They're using their dollar hoard to shore up the ruble. So I think on the whole, it's been good for the Russians, because it's made them realize that the Europeans are not their partners, but their enemies. It's made them realize that the Europeans are vassal states and do not have an independent foreign policy, and that the Europeans cannot act in Europe's interest. They have to support Washington's interest. And so they realize that there's really no future for their diplomacy with Europe, because Europe hasn't any independent diplomacy. Europe, NATO, this is an American puppet state. And so they're simply withdrawing from the integration of Russia with Europe that had been their initial intention. So I think you see now the rise of the strategic alliance between Russia and China. This is perfect for both countries, because the economies of each country are perfectly complementary with one another. And I think all of Asia will be pulled into that, certainly India. But all of Asia is just too powerful of an economic combination. And the West is dying. There's no doubt. The jobs in the United States have all been exported out, largely to China and India. The unemployment in Europe is extreme. You know today that the Swiss removed the peg on their currency, and their currency exploded upwards. You know that all of economic policy, both in the United States and in Europe, is driven for the support of a handful of big banks. So you have all this sovereign debt of these banks and the derivatives associated with them, and the entirety of the peoples of Europe are being sacrificed in order to keep these big banks afloat. So there's no real prospect for ordinary citizens in the West. It's over with. And you'll see the rise in the East now. The real question is whether the American neoconservatives are so determined to achieve hegemony over the world that they push this to the point of nuclear war. That's the real danger.
The next enemy on the list will be North Korea. That'll be their foothold into Asia, I suppose, if they go after them. But getting back to what you were saying about Russia and China, of course, Brzezinski's plan was to set them against each other. That's obviously failing.
Yes, it's obviously failing. Brzezinski, though, was superseded by the neoconservatives. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, the neoconservatives concluded that there was no longer any constraint on American power, and therefore Washington could dominate the world and exercise hegemony over both Russia and China. So this type of arrogance and hubris and insolence is basically insolence. You know, there's no saying, leadership leads to empire, empire begets insolence, insolence brings ruin. So I think that's where we are with the American neoconservatives. The hubris, the arrogance, the insolence has caused such a tremendous overreaching that it's brought about a strategic alliance between Russia and China, because they both realize they have the same enemy. And it's not one another, it's Washington. I think that alliance will change the whole nature of world politics.
For the better, I would imagine. Get back to the attacks in Paris. Do you foresee any further attacks, not necessarily in France, but in other European countries, just to bolster this this idiocy that that we're all to be afraid of Muslims and stuff like that?
Well, you know, if it is a false flag attack, then they're so used to getting away with false flag attacks that they will have more, because they serve the purpose. The media never shows the slightest suspicion. It always just parrots the official line. There's no investigation. No obvious questions get asked. And so, yes, there could be more. And what is coming out of these attacks, in addition to what I have covered and what we've talked about, is the rising police state. I mean, it's a very strong police state that's being created in Europe, in France now, in Britain. And the military security complex finds these events very beneficial to its power, because every time there's some sort of a terrorist event, real or false flag, the police state grows. It gets deeper roots. It gets a broader reach. It becomes more acceptable. You see, in the United States, we've had a massive growth in the police state, and it's because the people think they have to have it to be safe from terrorists.
Well, exactly the same in the UK, and I lost my train of thought for a second there. The fact that we are moving more and more into the police state, and it's getting harsher, shall we say, it fits in perfectly with the types of parties that are coming to the fore now, who will use it to its maximum.
That's right. The right-wing parties will accept it because they'll need it in order to clear out the immigrants.
Well, and to control their own populations, of course.
And to control them. That's right. And to control
okay, we've only got a few minutes left, a couple of minutes left. I know you're stuck for time. Your final words on it?
Well, in all of this, there can be hope. For example, if the Russians have decided to start playing the cards they hold, because all the cards are held by Russia, none by the EU or Washington. As I've said on a number of occasions, Russia can collapse NATO whenever it wishes. All it has to do is announce it does not sell energy to members of NATO, and that would be the end of the alliance. It can collapse the Western financial system. All it has to do is say, oh, well, we're not going to pay any interest this year on our debt. Yes, you've heard it. Yes, you've all heard us. Yes, these sanctions, and so we don't have the money to pay on our bonds. Oh, yes, you downgraded our credit, and this has hurt the bonds, and the price has fallen, and this makes the interest rate worse, and we just can't do anything. We're not defaulting. We'll pay you next year or in several years. And the banks that are holding that debt would experience angst. They would have a lot of trouble. So there are so many things they could do. The Chinese could similarly do things. They could simply dump all of their dollar-denominated holdings. Now, the Federal Reserve could print money to buy them up. But when the Chinese get all those dollars and they turn around and dump the dollars, the Fed cannot print foreign currencies with which to buy the dollars. And so the dollar would completely collapse and just be wiped out. China can do this whenever they want. So these countries hold the cards, and yet the idiots in Washington think they are all powerful and they hold the cards. It's just that China and Russia don't play the cards. They don't want to be provocative, and they don't think they need to play these cards. They think they can just withdraw from the Western payment system and turn to one another and self-finance. And that's their policy. If they start playing these cards, it's really going to get tough on the West. It really would be tough if they play these cards that they hold. So we'll see whether we keep antagonizing the people who hold the cards, or whether NATO breaks up over the gas issue, or whether NATO breaks up over the fact that the Europeans finally realize that they're being badly used by Washington and are paying all these costs in order to hurt the Russians. The cost, though, will probably be far higher on Europe. So it's entirely possible. I mean, if NATO were to break up, then this would stop the empire in its tracks. It would immediately wipe out the pressures for wars. The threat of a nuclear confrontation would be gone. And it's the best possible thing that could happen, would be the collapse of NATO. So maybe the Russians will realize that and collapse it.
Well, as I say, the only people that seem to want wars are those that are supposedly leading us, and all they do is lead poor people to their deaths, and who never wanted to go to war in the first place.
Yes, you know, Neil, there's a famous saying that the privilege of the people is to be wounded and killed in defense of their creditors.
Yeah, we all love our bankers, don't we? Yeah. Okay, well, thanks very much for your time, Paul, and hopefully we'll talk to you again sometime in the future.
I appreciate your interest, Neil. I appreciate your interest, Neil. Be glad to talk to you at any time.
Cheers. Take care.
All right. Bye. Cheers. All right. Cheers.